The Rains house stood 3 miles off the main road, nestled behind 2 acres of fruitless orchard and a wrought iron gate that never rusted. The front porch gleamed white even in storm season, and the windows, all 32 of them, were always closed. There was something sacred about how clean the place was. The neighbors, few and far between, used to say you could smell lemon oil halfway down the road, that sharp, waxy scent too clean for a house that full. Nothing ever creaked, nothing ever cried, no dog barked, and no child laughed. People remembered the children, though, always different ones, always young. They came in pairs or sometimes alone, usually brought in by train station volunteers or quietly from far-off counties no one talked about. Some came through orphanage referrals, or so the town was told. But when the county clerk finally investigated in 1973, he found no paperwork at all. Not one legal adoption, not one formal surrender, just children who arrived under blankets or in handmade dresses and never showed up at school. No photographs, no birthdays recorded, no public sightings past the first week. The last census had listed the Rains family as a household of 3. Vera Rains, aged 62, her son Victor, 25, and a third name, Celia, who was never seen and whose age changed with every official form. By the time Celia was listed as 17, no one even remembered if she'd ever been born in the first place. The census worker that year didn't get past the porch. Vera had answered the door in a pale blue dress, smiling but refused entry. She offered coffee in a bone china cup, answered every question calmly, said Victor was resting and Celia was studying. When asked about the other children sometimes seen in the yard, Vera simply blinked and said, "What other children?" Yet they had been seen. A little boy with one sleeve, a girl who limped in both legs, a red-haired child with no eyebrows who stared too long. One witness, now in his 80s, still swears he saw 7 children lined up behind the curtain in the living room, unmoving, watching him. He had come to repair a fuse box. Vera had led him to the basement stairs and told him never to open any door unless it was already ajar. He never went back. There were rumors, always soft, always quiet, that the children never left, that their shoes were seen hanging on a string in the back hallway like they'd been preserved, that the house sounded different depending on what time you walked past. Some said it sounded like humming. Others said nothing at all. The mailbox bore no name, just a brass plate with the letter. No one remembered when Mr. Rains had died or if he had ever existed. The tax records were always current. No bills were late. The grass never grew too tall. In 1982, a postal worker quit after delivering a package wrapped in oilcloth and sealed with wax. It made a wet clinking sound when it shifted in her hands. She said the smell wasn't lemon oil that day. She said it smelled like something sour trying to be sweet. The sheriff claimed there was never a complaint filed, but a deputy once reported a child's shoe on the edge of the property line, small, pink, with something white inside. By the time he came back with a warrant, the shoe was gone, and so was the deputy's report. Years later, that same deputy put his hand on the Bible and swore that Vera Rains had smiled at him across the lawn that day, but he couldn't remember if she was holding anything in her hand, or if that had only been a shadow. Some say the house was ordinary, just old and private. Others say you could feel it breathe when you got too close, like it had lungs in the walls. But no one argues this. Over the years, more than a dozen children were known to have entered that house, and not a single one was seen again. Mrs. Vera Rains didn't choose children like other families did. She didn't ask for happy ones or healthy ones or boys who could carry firewood. She never asked for intelligence or manners or the color of their eyes. Instead, she asked one question: do they bleed from the nose at night? That question, always the same, whispered to nurses, whispered to charity workers, whispered to priests. She didn't want the strong ones, she wanted the fragile ones, the ones that woke up trembling or sat too still or blinked too slowly in the sun. The ones who had trouble speaking. The ones who fainted after running. The ones who flinched from music. Records show she took in at least 16 over the course of 22 years. But only 5 names ever made it to any surviving paperwork, and none of those names matched the ones later found etched in the back of her pantry door. She asked for quiet ones, preferably with poor sleep and pale gums. If the child had been recently sick, that was even better. She didn't mind if they had no parents. She only minded if they had people looking for them. One of the social workers who processed the early placements, a woman named Darlene Graves, went missing in 1968. She returned in 1975. When asked where she'd been, she said she didn't remember. Her left eye was clouded over, blind. She lived out the rest of her days on a rocking chair, facing away from the road, muttering about bloodlines and filters and something she kept calling the sieve. Her daughter said she would wake up at night gasping for air, whispering numbers that never repeated and trying to claw something off her tongue that wasn't there. Vera had no interest in boys who ran fast or girls who sang well. She preferred ones with skin that bruised easily or mouths that didn't close all the way. There were rumors that she used a test, something she called the red mirror, where she made the child stand before a piece of polished glass and recite the same phrase over and over until their nose began to bleed. If the blood dripped straight down, she sent them back. But if it curved, if it pooled in the corner of the mouth or traced a line under the eye, then she said they had the mark. Later journals recovered from a locked drawer in her sewing room revealed coded entries. Each child was logged not by name but by symbol. A circle with a horizontal line, a triangle with 2 dots, a broken key. Next to each was a single word: willing, resistant, folded, complete. Several pages referenced the number 7 in different forms. 7 grams, 7 turns, 7 breaths, and always the word sieve. Medical experts would later describe a horrific pattern. Each child taken by Vera had displayed symptoms of what might now be classified as a neurological blood disorder. But back then, no one understood, and no one thought to question why one woman in a town of fewer than 1,000 had children dropped off at her gate year after year, and why none of them ever appeared at the doctor's office or the schoolhouse or the general store. One nurse recalled that Vera only smiled when the child had fainted during intake. Another said she asked for the hospital linens to be preserved unwashed and returned to her. When denied, she mailed a white dress covered in old blood to the nurse's house, folded with a ribbon and a note that read, "This one passed through clean." Years later, a child's diary was found under a floorboard in the attic. The entries stopped suddenly, but one of the last pages was dated June 3, 1964. It read, "She said I have good veins. She said my silence is a gift. I keep hearing the ticking in the walls. I think it's counting something. I think it's counting me." Vera Raines never denied these choices. She didn't hide them. She just made them look like mercy. To outsiders, she was the gentle widow who took in the sick and the strange. But behind her lace curtains, she wasn't nursing weakness. She was harvesting it, and every child with a bleeding nose was another key, not to open a door, but to prove who deserved to stay inside. Victor Raines was not listed on any school registry, not baptized at any local church, and never appeared in family photographs. Yet nearly everyone in the town claimed they had seen him once, just once, and always by accident. A flicker through the curtains when the moon was high, a shape in the stairwell when Vera forgot to close the front door fully, a whisper from the attic that sounded too old for a child but too fragile for a man. No one could agree on his age. Some said he was born sick. Others insisted he wasn't born at all, but made. He never came out during the day. That much was certain. One postman swore he caught sight of a boy standing in the hallway, bathed in blue shadows, long limbs coiled like rope, hands gloved though the house was warm. The boy didn't blink. He just tilted his head and closed the door slowly. Afterward, the postman reported persistent migraines and nosebleeds that lasted for weeks. He was later dismissed from the route for refusing to pass by the Rains property again. He said the boy's eyes didn't reflect the light. They caught it and kept it. Victor was thin enough to fold. That phrase kept returning in witness statements. Thin enough to fold. His wrists bore scars in perfect rings like cuffs had been sewn into the skin and later removed. When contractors were called in to check the home's wiring in 1979, one of them reported hearing footsteps above him while working in the crawl space. Soft, slow, patterned like a metronome. He looked up through a vent and saw pale feet in black slippers, heel-marked, positioned perfectly still for over an hour. The homeowner insisted no one else was in the house. The contractor never returned for payment. In the sheriff's files, there's a note written in pencil on the back of a grocery receipt. It reads, "Victor avoids direct heat, sweats when near brass, mouth doesn't open all the way, smiles without teeth, doesn't breathe right." The handwriting isn't signed. The file was slipped into the folder long after the case was closed. Some say Victor was Vera's biological son. Others believe he was a child taken early, reshaped into something else, something obedient. A neighbor swore he saw Vera hanging white gloves on a line at dusk every Thursday. Always 7 pairs, even when it hadn't rained. Another claimed he watched a boy in the window wearing a paper mask shaped like a bird, standing so still it looked like a cutout. The lights flickered the moment their eyes met, and when the man looked again, the window was empty. Victor didn't speak like a child. Those who heard him, a meter reader, a census worker, the woman who delivered eggs, all described the same thing. A whisper, low and slow, as if each word was being pulled out of a deep place. Some said it didn't sound like speech at all, but like something imitating it, something that knew the sound but not the meaning. One described it as breath caught on glass. Another said it was like hearing your name underwater. When police finally entered the house decades later, they found no photographs of Victor. But in the wallpaper of the attic bedroom, tiny pinpricks formed lines, outlines of a figure lying down, curled into itself, repeated over and over as if someone had traced his shape by pushing needles through from the other side. In one closet, they found an outline of a boy's body, and not painted, but scorched faintly into the floor, arms tucked, knees raised, a perfect burn in the wood with no source. Victor Rains was never declared dead. He was never found. But in the old pantry behind the spice rack, there was a small drawer with 7 pairs of children's gloves. Inside each, fingers were sewn closed with wax thread. All identical, all left-handed. On the palm of one, someone had written in pressed pencil, "He only moved at dusk." The glove was damp, not with water, but with something that smelled faintly of lemon oil and something else. Something like rust. The box had no label, no case number, no chain of custody. It was sealed with cord and wax and buried in the deepest cabinet of the county records room, behind divorce filings and farm deeds from the 1800s. It was only discovered when the building was being cleared for asbestos. The man who opened it, a retired court clerk named Hoyt Miller, hadn't worked a case in over 20 years, but the moment the wax cracked, he went pale. He said he'd seen them before. Once. Just once. Late at night, when Vera Rains had appeared unannounced, asking for assistance with her private files. He'd helped her carry the folder up 3 flights, and when she pulled back the flap, he remembered the look of the pages. Not the content. Just the texture. That terrible texture, Each sheet inside the box was vellum-thin but not paper. Under a microscope, the fibers didn't match any known material. No pulp, no textile, no synthetic weave. Just long, delicate strands woven so tightly they moved when breathed upon. When touched, the pages flexed with a strange give, like something that still remembered being alive, and they were marked, not typed, not printed. The lines had been etched by hand, not written with ink but carved with something sharp and exact. Every form followed the same pattern, a child's first name only, a blank where the last name should go, followed by medical annotations no one could trace to any standard hospital terminology. There were entries like elevated red tone under nails, clean fold behind ear, confirmed quiet before second sleep, and 7-count pulse irregularity. Where the signatures belonged, there were no signatures at all, just raised scars, thick and bubbled, forming crude lines. As if someone had burned the names onto the parchment with a brand small as a pin. The stamp on each document was real enough, the county seal pressed deep in red wax. But the wax bled at the edges, soaking into the parchment as if feeding on it. The seal was crisp, but everyone bore the wrong year. Not off by months, off by decades. Some records claimed to be from 1902, some from 1917, even though Vera Raines didn't arrive in town until 1946. It was as if the papers had been waiting for her long before she ever showed up. Hoyt Miller lasted 3 days after the discovery. He died in his sleep, eyes open, hands clenched around a bedsheet twisted like cord. In his home, officials found a single envelope. Inside was a child's tooth, still wet. On the back of the envelope were the words, "She brought them already processed." Forensics couldn't match the material to anything in their systems. One technician insisted it was dermal, human skin, but stretched, stripped, and reprocessed into something paper-thin. The pores were still visible under magnification. Tiny follicles, empty but present. And faint blue lines like faded veins threaded through each sheet in soft, symmetrical patterns. In the lower left corner of each document, a strange sigil had been pressed. Not in wax, but in something black and oily, a circular shape with 7 inward-facing hooks. It appeared to be a kind of stamp, but it left behind a cold residue that clung to fingers even after washing. When viewed under ultraviolet light, the papers pulsed faintly, revealing an 8th symbol only visible at certain angles. A figure curled inside a ring, mouth stitched, eyes weeping. It became clear to investigators that these weren't legal forms. They were something else entirely, not records of guardianship, not state-certified adoptions, but agreements. Rituals in contract form. Signed not with names, but with tissue, with skin, with pain. The children were never meant to be claimed. They were processed, categorized, selected like ingredients. A final page was tucked at the bottom of the box, smaller than the rest. On it, no name, no scar, just one line etched deep enough to slice through. Once named, they are no longer yours. Once sealed, they belong to the mother of silence. The box was resealed and sent for archiving, but the archivist who logged it never finished the report. He vanished 2 weeks later. His car was found abandoned near the orchard behind the old Raines house, the trunk empty, the seat soaked in something clear. The smell, they said, was lemon oil, and something else, something that clung to the throat. The roses had always bloomed too early. That was what neighbors used to say, half joking, half watching. Even in frost, the Raines garden was full. Nothing ever wilted, nothing ever rotted. Vera Raines had a way with soil, they said, a quiet magic in her hands. But it wasn't until the back wall began to crumble from years of neglect that anyone looked deeper. The bricks, weathered and brittle, gave way in 1993 when a team of preservationists was sent to catalog the remains of the Raines property for historical records. What they found behind that wall wasn't a time capsule. It wasn't a vault of family mementos or canned peaches sealed during the war. It was a cavity, dry and hollow, lined with teeth. They were packed carefully into compartments, narrow slits carved into the plaster and sealed with linen. Each pocket held between 6 to 10 teeth, all children's, all small, all cleaned. There was no dust, no debris, just the cold gleam of enamel and the smell of dried flowers mixed with something faintly chemical. At first it was assumed to be animal remains. Then they found the tags. Dozens of them. Old paper scraps wrapped in twine and tied to tiny brass pins above each cavity. They were yellowed, brittle, and handwritten in the same small, tight script, initials and dates, no last names, no explanations, just sequences like RL, April 1961, or MS, November 1957. One tag read V, spare set, but no one could agree whether that referred to Victor or someone else entirely. It was the only one without a month. Some of the teeth had been drilled, not with surgical precision but with something cruder, a hand-cranked tool or an awl. The holes weren't for medical reasons. They were for stringing. Several rows of molars still had traces of thread through them, discolored red and stiffened, like they'd once been worn or displayed. Investigators documented over 400 teeth in total. Enough to suggest not just one lifetime, but many. Far more than the official count of children ever placed at the Raines residence. When questioned, older townsfolk admitted that, yes, more children had come and gone than anyone had cared to track. One retired mail carrier recalled seeing different pairs of shoes on the back step every few weeks. Another said he thought Vera must have hosted out-of-county children for holidays. But the dates on the tags didn't match school breaks. They matched disappearances. No medical office in the state had a record of any mass extractions. No pediatric dentist remembered seeing a single Raines child. And yet, some of the teeth showed signs of repeat trauma. Roots shattered, nerve damage, bone worn smooth by time. These weren't collected from under pillows. They weren't saved as keepsakes. They were taken, methodically, like harvesting. A forensic analyst found traces of clove oil on several specimens, the kind used to numb pain during dental work. But others had nothing. No signs of numbing, no clean cuts, just broken roots and pressure fractures. One tooth had a strange black ring around the base, later confirmed to be soot from an open flame. It had been heated before removal. The real horror wasn't just in the numbers or the method, it was in the organization. Each row of teeth was spaced evenly, each cavity marked with care. Some were even polished. One set had tiny gold caps fitted over the tips, too small for any known procedure, too decorative to serve a medical purpose. That set was tagged only with the letter E and the words, First Harmony. The lead investigator asked for silence in the garden that day. No one spoke as they pulled the last rows free. At the bottom of the wall, hidden behind a loose panel, was a final object. A child's jawbone intact with 4 teeth still attached. A paper tag hung from the bone with a rusted wire. It read, "Did not quiet." The report filed that month made no mention of the wall's deeper foundation, which appeared to slope downward into the earth beneath the garden. That part of the excavation was sealed off by state order after only 3 hours. What they found inside was never made public. But those who touched the bone, the ones who handled the teeth, all reported the same sensation afterward, a dull ache in the gums as if something was missing. Something small, familiar, and stolen long ago. The orchard was still standing. Even after the Raines house collapsed from rot and neglect, even after the foundation split and the porch caved inward like a pulled tooth, The trees behind it kept growing. They bore fruit every season, even when the air turned bitter and the soil froze 2 inches down. There were no bees, no birds, no pollination, just the fruit, always ripe, always waiting, and always hollow. The skin of the pears peeled back without resistance. Inside there was no seed, no core. Just an empty chamber lined with something fibrous and pale, and in some cases a small human hair curled like thread against the inner wall. Botanists were called in to study the anomaly. They examined the trees with gloves and clipped branches for lab review. The sap wasn't sweet. It was clear, cold, and slightly oily. When exposed to air, it dried fast and left a tacky film. Soil samples revealed something worse. The roots weren't pulling nutrients from the ground. They were wrapped around bone, human bone. Not scattered like an old graveyard, but structured, deliberate. In one plot, the roots of 2 trees had grown into the shape of a child's rib cage. One on each side, mirrored, curling into themselves like a cradle. One tree, broader than the rest, bore rough patches on its trunk where the bark peeled differently. When tested, the patches weren't wood at all, but a hardened layer of calcified tissue. Under that crust, something soft. A piece was removed carefully and sent to pathology. It was skin, human in origin, dermal layer intact, unrotted. Beneath it, tucked inside the tree's own flesh, was a small, preserved ear. Still whole, still pink. They stopped testing after that, but the state requested further review, so the trees were mapped, root lines drawn out, and ground-penetrating radar brought in. That's when they discovered the pattern. The orchard wasn't planted randomly. It was laid out in circles. Concentric rings growing outward from a central pit behind the garden wall. The oldest tree stood in the exact center, its bark darker, almost black, and its branches lower than the others, as if bending under the weight of something no one could see. Beneath that tree, soil probes struck a layer of flattened bone no thicker than a sheet of paper. One technician said it crunched like dry leaves but left behind a metallic smell on her gloves. The fruit was tested too. No genetic record matched known pear or apple species. The flesh resembled melon, but the taste was faintly sweet and numb on the tongue, like the aftertaste of anesthesia. One sample cut open revealed a string of something soft inside, not muscle, not plant fiber. Later, under a microscope, it was identified as braided keratin. Human hair, woven tight, curled into a spiral in the center of the fruit. Locals said the orchard had always looked too perfect. The branches never broke. No tree had ever been struck by lightning. No storm had leveled a limb. And no child who entered the orchard was seen again. One neighbor swore that in her youth she watched Vera Raines lead a little girl between the trees just after sundown, holding her hand gently, whispering to her. The girl was never reported missing, but the next harvest, the orchard bore twice the usual fruit, and that year the pears had a faint pink blush at the base that hadn't been there before. They tried burning the orchard once. Volunteers, unsanctioned, gathered at dusk with gasoline and torches. The flames took to the bark, but not the branches. The fire rose, then collapsed into smoke before reaching the canopy. The next morning, the scorched tree trunks were whole again, unburned. But where the flames had touched, dozens of thin scratches now marked the bark. Small lines, each one resembling tally marks. They counted 73. No one went back after that. To this day, nothing grows near the Raines orchard. Grass refuses to spread beyond its edge. Insects avoid the soil. Even birds reroute around it. But the trees remain, ripe, waiting. And no one dares take the fruit anymore. Not since one man, a vagrant passing through, plucked a pear and bit into it whole. Hours later, he was found on the roadside, weeping, pulling at his teeth, whispering about mouths that had never been his. The chimney was bricked shut from the inside. Not sealed to keep something out, but to keep something in. It was only during a full structural teardown that the mason's hammer struck hollow. Behind a thin partition of crumbling mortar was a leather-bound book, dry to the touch but warm at its core, as if it had been breathing beneath the hearth for years. The spine bore no title, just the impression of two interlocked circles, one smooth, one jagged. Its pages were stiff, unevenly cut, and darkened at the edges with something that flaked but never faded. The ledger, once opened, revealed everything Vera Raines had ever done. Every child who entered the house had been recorded, not by name, but by code. She used initials paired with symbols, a triangle over an eye, a circle with a line through it, a vertical slash with 7 dots. Each entry began with a condition noted, followed by her observations in cramped, looping script. Voice remains too loud during sleep. Refuses harmony when tested against reflection. Exhibits teeth clenching at signs of affection. Bleeds improperly from the upper jaw. There were no diagnoses, only judgments. Next came the treatments. But the words were not medical. They were ritual. Glass tongue correction appeared more than once, often marked with follow-ups like slippage reoccurred or partial clarity achieved. One entry simply read, "Mouth removal, successful." No elaboration, no hesitation. Across several pages, Vera described a procedure called rethreading. It was used, she wrote, when children fractured in tone or spoke in loops. The process involved something sharp, something heated, and a chair she only referred to as the cradle. The treatment ended when the child stopped producing sound for 3 nights in a row. If they woke from sleep humming, the process had to begin again. One child required 12 sessions. The note beneath their code read, "Silence secured, root stable." Another section was titled "Whitened Lungs." This involved prolonged submersion in soft bleach and memory cloth. The entry did not explain what memory cloth was, only that it had to be wrapped 7 times around the chest and pressed inward until the child no longer resisted. If the child resisted again during recall, the treatment was to be repeated with the addition of cooling wires. More chilling than the methods was Vera's tone. There was no emotion, no urgency. The ledger read like a maintenance log, each child reduced to a mechanism in need of adjustment. One girl, marked L.E., August 1963, was noted to have bright gaze, discordant laughter, seeks exit through mirrors. Her treatment was listed as soundproofing stage 2. That term appeared often in the later pages, typically beside notes about sleepwalking, mimicry, or uncontained humming. In the final quarter of the book, the entries became less structured, the handwriting more frantic, looping over itself in places. Dates began to overlap. Treatments were crossed out and reworded. Mouth stitch became smile fix. Spinal anchoring became centerline realignment. Some entries stopped mid-sentence, trailing into scratches. One page, blank except for a single note, read, "Victor slipped again." Needs folding, it was clear that Vera believed what she was doing was corrective, not punishment, not sadism, correction, precision. Her mind, warped as it was, had formed a system around pain. Pain as medicine, as purification. Children weren't children to her. They were puzzles. Songs off key, words spoken wrong, flesh that betrayed its purpose until it was shaped, silenced, softened. At the back of the ledger, tucked between 2 glued pages, was a folded note written in a different hand. Smaller, messier. Likely a child's. It read, "If you are reading this, I am still here. Not gone. Just quiet. Please do not fix me." Beneath it, in Vera's hand, was one final note. "Route incomplete. Child retained for refinement. Authorities sealed the ledger in evidence storage." But in the weeks after its discovery, two of the officers who handled it reported a strange clicking sound in their sleep, like a spoon tapping against teeth. Both experienced mouth pain with no physical cause. One lost 2 teeth overnight. The dentist said the roots looked twisted, pulled from the inside. The officer swore he heard humming just before they came loose. The ledger was moved, then moved again. Finally, it was buried in a box marked inactive. But even now, those who touched it remember the smell it left behind. Not mold, not paper. Something faint, medicinal. Something that stung the eyes and clung to the tongue. Something Vera once called purity. Something she believed you had to carve to reach. For years, the sound drifted across the trees at exactly 3:13 in the morning. Not loud, not sudden, but steady like breath from an open mouth. The town never spoke of it directly. They called it a hum, a wind, maybe coyotes. But those who lived closest to the Rains property knew better. They had counted the voices, heard the pauses, noticed how the melody never changed even when the seasons did. Always the same tune, always the same rhythm, like it was being played from the same memory no matter what year it was. No one could find the hymn in any hymnal, nor did any church claim it. There were no recordings until 1974, when a ham radio operator named Willis Keene accidentally captured it during a thunderstorm. He was tracking static interference when he tuned into a signal carrying a slow, discordant melody layered in children's voices. High, breathless, and faintly out of sync, as if they were being cued by something unseen. The audio was scratchy, but the lyrics were clear enough to write down. The first line, "She stitched the light into our heads." Experts reviewed the tape. The voices were unmistakably young. The melody was structured in 6 descending tones repeated in sets of 3. Each verse ended with a breath that wasn't quite a gasp. Not tired, not pained, but timed. Practiced. The full hymn lasted exactly 2 minutes and 33 seconds, stopping without a single trailing sound. The words shifted across verses. Sown eyes see better. Our tongues were bitten to hush. She opens the ground with her hands. And then the final verse. We fold where we're told. And the silence is clean. Willis Keene shared the tape with authorities, who filed it away without comment. Weeks later, his radio tower collapsed in a windless night. No storm, no explanation. The metal had folded inward at its base as if pulled down from above. Keene disappeared 3 days later, leaving behind a house where every window had been covered in paper. On the walls were pencil-written lines from the hymn, looping endlessly, bleeding into one another. Survivors of the Rains home, few as they were, unofficial and unspoken, later described the hymn not as music but as a requirement. They sang it every night before the lights dimmed, eyes closed, hands flat on their thighs. If anyone missed a word, Vera would pause the ritual, restart it, sometimes more than once. One child, marked only as DS in the ledger, was made to repeat the final verse 17 times in one night. The ledger entry beside his code read, "Voice cracking, left in sieve room for tuning." The hymn was meant to do something, though no one could say what. It wasn't just control, it wasn't just obedience, it was transformation. Vera believed that children were born out of tune with the world, that their noise, their chatter, their pain, their natural rhythms, corrupted the purity of silence. And so she crafted the song to strip that noise away. Not kill it, refine it, soften it into shape. A song to rewire the body. The children didn't sing with feeling. The recordings make that clear. Their voices were measured, careful, hollow. No emotion, no hesitation, no breath between syllables. As if the words weren't theirs. As if the meaning had been carved into them like a second mouth. The line, "She stitched the light into our heads," appears 3 times throughout. Some believe it's a reference to surgical procedures. Others think it means something older, something buried in ritual. A musicologist who analyzed the melody noticed something else. When the hymn was reversed, slowed, and filtered for high-frequency noise, an undercurrent of whispers appeared beneath the melody. Not human voices, but clicks and hisses forming repeating syllables that no one could translate. As if the song wasn't meant for human ears. As if it was a call. Or worse, a reply. The state eventually sealed the original recording. It's never been aired publicly. But in certain corners of the county and the dense parts of the woods near the collapsed remains of the Rains' home, hikers still claim to hear singing in the distance. Always faint, always at 3:13 a.m., the same verse over and over. We fold where we're told, and the silence is clean. They say the melody lingers in the air long after it stops, and if you stay too long, you'll start humming it without meaning to. And once you do, you can't forget it, not even in your sleep. The doorway to the basement was hidden behind the old coal stove, sealed with a panel of false brick and a layer of lemon-scented wax paper that cracked like bone when peeled away. The stairs led down into darkness, narrow and steep, with each wooden step warped by damp and something far heavier than water. The air changed before the floor was reached. It didn't just smell, it pressed against the lungs, thick and metallic. At the bottom, past the rusted furnace and behind a false wall of shelves lined with empty jars, was a round room. 6 feet wide, no corners, tiled entirely in dented sheets of nickel-plated steel. They called it the sieve room. At the center of the floor was a circular grate, about 12 inches across, rusted red. Beneath it ran a narrow pipe that led into the ground, direction unknown. Around the perimeter of the room were hooks, not the kind used in kitchens, but surgical, curved and sharp, hanging from short chains bolted into the ceiling. Most were crusted. Some were labeled in ink that had long since bled into the metal. One simply read tongue, another soft mouth. The floor sloped subtly inward, drawing anything spilled to the grate in the middle. There were stains that had turned black with age, shaped like puddles that had never dried properly. On the far wall was a sink with no faucet. It was fed by a copper pipe coiled tightly like a throat. When tested, the pipe still dripped. Not water, but a thin, oily substance with a bleach base and faint traces of sulfur. Its smell lingered on the skin long after washing. Vera kept a ledger down there too. Not the main one, not the treatment book. This was different. Smaller, wrapped in cloth, damp to the touch. It contained only procedures, no names, no dates, just method after method written in calm, patient handwriting. One entry was titled Vocal Clarity Through Burned Steam. The instructions read, bring water to boil, add 1 spoon powdered bleach, suspend child with chin raised, instruct humming, if sound falters begin again. Another was titled Purification by Tension. It required a series of clamps positioned behind the jaw, applied while the child was encouraged to sing. If the pitch changed too soon, the clamps were tightened. Most disturbing was a procedure labeled Smile Setting. It involved slicing the cheeks from the inside, then pinning them outward with invisible thread until the face remained fixed, even in rest. The entry noted that silence was preferable during this process, but muffled sounds were acceptable if rhythmically consistent. One note at the bottom read, Victor endured this 3 times. Third attempt held tools were found in a rusted drawer beneath the sink. Pliers, bone hooks, glass tubes still sealed with wax. Several of the tubes held fine white threads that dissolved when touched by air. One tray contained dental tools filed to sharpness, each labeled with single letters. F, L, M, V. The meaning was never explained. The walls of the sieve room had strange dents at shoulder height, as if small bodies had been pressed hard against them again and again. In the farthest corner was a low stool made of unpainted wood. The legs were stained. The seat was carved with faint symbols. 3 lines, one curved, one straight, one crossed. On the ceiling, barely visible through years of grime, was a sentence etched into the metal in backwards handwriting. When mirrored, it read, "No child leaves louder than they arrived." The investigators who entered the room wore protective suits. Still, 3 of them reported recurring nosebleeds in the weeks that followed. One suffered hearing loss in a single ear. The trauma specialist assigned to evaluate the site retired shortly after, citing recurring nightmares in which he heard humming through a drain in his own bathroom floor. They sealed the room after documenting every inch. But before they left, one officer shone a flashlight into the grate. Something deep below reflected light, not water, not metal, just a glint, small, wet, and moving slowly out of view. When they dropped a mic down the pipe, it picked up a faint rhythmic tapping. 4 beats, then 5, then 4 again. As if something below had been listening all along. As if something still there was counting the silence and waiting for someone to sing. In the attic of the Rains house, among the dust-caked trunks and moth-eaten quilts, there sat a shelf no one had noticed before. It was nailed unevenly into the rafters, held in place by what looked like fishing wire and stiffened cloth. On it stood a single glass jar, tall, narrow-necked, sealed with thick wax and wrapped 3 times in red twine. The surface was coated in dust, but the contents were visible even before the lid was cracked. They moved, slowly, independently, even while the jar sat untouched, perfectly still. Inside were dozens of baby teeth, yellowed and worn, yet whole, some with roots, some blunt and smooth. But they did not rest at the bottom as expected. They floated, not suspended in a gel or resting in sediment, but circling one another gently as if caught in a current that didn't exist. The liquid wasn't water. It wasn't alcohol or any chemical preservation fluid known to the lab. It was thick but not cloudy, slightly luminous but gave off no heat. It held the teeth in constant motion, not rapid or chaotic, but rhythmic like breathing or the tick of a second hand. When the jar was first opened under lab conditions, the movement slowed, then stopped completely. The teeth dropped to the bottom like stones, but as soon as the lid was resealed and the temperature matched the attic's again, the motion resumed. Testing revealed no magnetic influence, no vibration. The liquid did not react to touch, to heat, to UV light. But it did react to sound. During a routine analysis, a technician left the jar near an audio monitor playing back archival recordings from the Rains estate. As the 1974 hymn recording began, the same captured by ham radio on a stormy night, the teeth began to stir again, faster this time. They rotated in wide loops, clustering in 3s before scattering apart. Each time the children's voices rose in pitch, the liquid pulsed. When the final verse played, the teeth turned all at once, facing outward toward the glass wall of the jar as if listening. The lab was evacuated. Audio footage confirmed the movement. Still, most dismissed it as vibration or coincidence, until a second recording was played. This one from a tape recovered near the sieve room, marked only tuning session 5. It featured the sound of a child humming, interrupted by short bursts of metallic clinks and a faint sobbing noise. The moment the hum began, the liquid inside the jar began to bubble, not boil. Bubble, as if something beneath was responding. 3 of the teeth lifted toward the top and struck the glass in perfect unison. Not hard, just enough to be heard. One of the analysts, a mother of 2, refused to re-enter the room. She reported a pressure behind her eyes and a sensation of something small and sharp pressing into her lower jaw. She later underwent dental imaging, which showed faint circular impressions beneath her gum line. as if something had once been there, removed cleanly and left behind a memory in the tissue. The liquid was later tested against over 200 known compounds. It matched none. It contained no water, no oil, no protein, and no synthetic markers. Under extreme magnification, the fluid showed microscopic filaments, not alive, not dead, not cellular. They responded only to high-pitched sound in childlike frequencies. When exposed to adult vocal range, the liquid darkened. When exposed to silence, it cleared. Theories emerged. Some believed the jar was a control mechanism, a kind of sound-based neurological recorder. Others said it was a listening device tuned not to hear but to remember. A few suggested the jar was the byproduct of the sieve room's waste, the last residue of purification. But one note, handwritten in the margin of Vera's final ledger page, hinted at something worse. It read, "Collected residue from third folding. Movement sustained only when harmony is true." The jar now sits in a secure lab sealed in triple containment. It has not stopped moving. Even with no sound, no external contact, the teeth continue to swirl slowly, like they are waiting for something. A cue, a voice, a name. And though no official test has confirmed it, those who have stood close to the jar long enough all report the same thing. A faint ringing in the ear. Not pain. Just a tone, like the first note of a song they forgot how to sing. They didn't expect to find anyone alive. By 1996, the Rains house was already half collapsed, long abandoned, condemned by the state after years of unanswered questions and silent files. A demolition crew had been sent to flatten the remaining structure. They moved carefully, breaking walls section by section, watching for rot, for mold, for nests in the beams. What they found behind the east wall of the second-floor hallway was not a nest. It was a cavity, dry, sealed. And inside it, curled like something forgotten, was Victor Rains. He was impossibly thin, not starved, preserved. His limbs were bound to the wall by thin wire that cut through skin and muscle, but somehow never severed completely. His mouth was open not from shock or breath, but because it had been fixed that way. The cheeks pulled back and stitched to his jawline in a stretched, unnatural smile. The thread was not surgical. It was waxed, coarse, the kind used in old bookbinding. His lips had split long ago. The corners of his mouth were raw, the skin scarred in layers where the stitches had been replaced again and again. Victor did not cry. He did not flinch. He did not move until they cut the final wire from his shoulder. Then slowly he raised his head and opened his mouth wider, just enough to form one word. It came out dry, broken by years of disuse, but the investigators heard it clearly. Mother. His eyes were worse. They were not eyes at all. Where sockets should have held sight, there were small mirrored lenses, rounded cold, silvered on the inside. They had been sewn into the skin with tiny loops of metal, as if they were meant to stay. When light hit them, it reflected not outward but back into the sockets, like the glass was feeding something internal. Later, under medical care, it was discovered that his optic nerves had been severed cleanly and replaced with copper wiring that served no function. He hadn't seen in years. He had been made to reflect. Scars ran the length of his arms and legs, symmetrical and numbered in pencil beside each wound. The numbers started at 1 on the inside of his left ankle and ended at 78 just beneath his collarbone. Each one had been opened and closed with the same care, the same thread, the same intention. There were no infections, no signs of decay. He had been kept alive with purpose. Victor was never able to testify, not in any legal sense. His vocal cords had been removed entirely, replaced with a tube that allowed for shallow breath but no sound. He could hum, faintly, and he did. The same 6-note pattern over and over, the same one found in the Rains hymn. When asked questions, he tapped one finger. Always 4 times, then paused, then 5, then 4 again. In the end, they called him a witness, but he was not there to explain. He was a template, Vera's final creation, her idea of a child perfected, silenced, shaped, and forced to smile forever. There was no courtroom drama, no confession, no names read aloud. When Vera Raines was finally taken into custody, she walked without resistance, her hands folded like she was headed to church. There were no children to testify, no bodies to bring forward, no single piece of evidence that the state was willing to call irrefutable. Only one living boy, Victor, stitched into silence, surgically erased. And even he was deemed unfit to speak, though his presence in the courtroom was haunting enough. When wheeled past the jury, he tilted his head upward and hummed that same low pattern beneath the gauze. But no one understood what it meant. The ledger had been sealed, the jar had been removed. The teeth catalogued, the orchard mapped, and the sieve room photographed in full. But none of it amounted to proof the law could use. The language in her records was called metaphor. The signatures on the skin pages dismissed as artistic cruelty, not legal contracts. The pipe beneath the grate was deemed too corroded for tracing. The attic's movements were labeled unrepeatable phenomena. All the parts were there, but stitched apart just enough to fall outside the reach of justice. Vera never answered questions, she simply stared. Not smug, not shaken. Only steady, like she had seen something through that no one else could begin to understand. Her lawyer called her a grieving widow with delusions, a woman who took in damaged children and tried to heal them in ways she thought were kind. He painted her as misunderstood, broken herself. The court let it stand. She died in a holding cell 3 months later during the second week of trial preparation. There was no trauma, no sign of illness. Her body was found in perfect posture, eyes closed, mouth smiling gently. In her lap was a single scrap of paper folded 4 times. It read only, "Nothing louder than silence." The media never received the image. The file was sealed and marked as inconclusive. Her house was burned the week after, not by order of the state, but by hands who had waited too long. The fire started at the back wall and spread inward. The orchard did not burn. Even when flames licked the lowest limbs, the bark remained untouched, fruit still ripe on the trees. No charges were filed. No one claimed credit. The town tried to forget. But the hymn still played, not from speakers or radios, but from somewhere in the air itself. It drifted in through vents, hummed faintly beneath floorboards, lingered just long enough to leave a chill behind. And one night, just before first frost, a woman walking her dog past the ruins saw a child standing near the ash pile. Pale, thin, barefoot, head tilted to the sky. He was humming, and when she turned to speak, he was already gone. Only the sound remained, quiet, rhythmic, familiar. 4 tones, then 5, then 4 again. Just enough to keep the silence from settling. In 2017, the town approved the garden not to remember, but to cover. It was built on the outer edge of the property where the porch once stood, where the stairs had rotted and the white door had stayed locked for decades. They called it a children's peace garden. A neat curve of stone, a ring of wildflowers, and a plaque etched with 7 first names. Names they could verify. Names that made it onto paper. But as the soil was turned, something surfaced beneath the new mulch and clean earth. A fragment, smooth and still damp. It wasn't bone. It was parchment, and it wept when exposed to air. The crew stopped work immediately. A team from the State Archaeological Board was brought in, thinking they'd found remnants of the earlier investigation. But these weren't tagged pieces. They hadn't been documented. They weren't old. The parchment was soft, warm to the touch, and still smelled faintly of lemon oil. Within the hour, they uncovered 4 more sheets folded into tight spirals and buried vertically like seeds. Each one held a list, not treatment notes, not rituals, names, dozens of them, each written in raised lettering formed by tiny scars, as if someone had written the names into the material using heat and pressure. None of the names matched any state record. These were children never seen, never counted, never whispered about, and yet the documents listed exact symptoms, exact conditions. Sleeps without rhythm, lacks reflective gaze, resists softening. One entry simply read, refused stillness. The most recent date written beside it was 1994, 2 years before Victor was found, years after the house had supposedly been empty. The ink hadn't faded, the flesh hadn't dried. When the documents were archived, they were sealed in a controlled environment, monitored for chemical decay. But in the weeks following, the container's humidity remained oddly stable, never dropping below a certain point, as if the papers were generating their own moisture. One technician said the pages made a sound when moved, not crinkling but something faintly musical like a hum caught in cloth. He later recorded the pattern and matched it against national records. It aligned perfectly with the Rains hymn. That recording, once verified, was submitted to the National Archive for Historical Anomalies. The Rains hymn is now a recognized cultural artifact, not folklore, not local myth, a documentable piece of American history. It is stored without playback permission, and audio researchers are required to wear sound-canceling headgear when studying its waveform, because when it plays in full, the air moves differently. And on one occasion, the teeth of a researcher's child, sleeping in another room, began to loosen without cause. The garden remains open. Visitors walk the stone path. They leave toys, trinkets, prayers. Some plant seedlings and return weeks later to find them shriveled, not eaten or broken, just turned away from the earth. The flowers that bloom best are those that require no rooting. Floating kinds, hollow-stemmed, they grow fast and fall fast. But the grass never dies. It stays short, green, too perfect. Like something below is still watching, still whispering its rules through the dirt. What happened in that house was not just evil. It was structured, polished, hidden beneath routines so clean they never invited suspicion. A house that smelled like lemon oil, a woman who smiled, a boy who hummed without eyes. The silence didn't come from fear, it came from something deeper. The belief that quiet meant safety, that control was kindness, that stillness was healing, that if no one screamed, no one was hurt. But the truth doesn't settle. It folds, it waits, and sometimes it grows again, even in gardens meant to bury it. What do you think? Could it happen again? Would we hear it this time? Or would we just smile and say nothing and let the silence bloom?